All right, we'll go with it. But I'm Lauren Springer. I am doing this breakouts presentation, and I just want to say that this is not mine on my own. Shannon Baker, Don Formo, and Cynthia Headley, who all teach at Cal San Marcos. I'm at Mount San Jacinto Community College. But this is wholly ours equally. We've been doing this work for quite a few years now. And just with timing stuff, I just wanted to come and present, and they're doing other presentations. We're going to be at C's next week if anybody's going, and we're going to do a larger workshop for on the same topic in case you'll be there. So again, I'm Lauren Springer. I'm the faculty PD and DE coordinator at my community college, but I'm also full-time in the English department. So this is listening to student writers' questions and linguistic justice and student-led feedback. So I want to take a minute. This will be interactive, I promise. So I'm going to ask you to do some things in the chat and sometimes unmute. But first, so this quote in this particular book, the editors or the authors said, "What can educators do to build more equitable and just learning spaces for our multilingual students?" And so I'm just curious if you all just want to put in the chat. I know there's going to be lots of good stuff. What have you been doing to make your classrooms, your institutions more equitable and just learning spaces for our multilingual students? Feel free to unmute if you want to, but for chat.
I know we've come a long way just to meet up again.
Hi, Rick.
Yeah. Hey, now I'm looking at this and considering your question, I'm thinking, well, shoot, the first thing is understand the culture that we're trying to address. I don't get half of my students until I start talking to them and asking questions.
Yeah, right. Talking to them, something that we don't unfortunately always have time to do, or if we're online, it's harder to do, but absolutely talking to them. I love it. What else have you all done or started? All right, Diana put in the chat, community building between students and asking them to share their languages. I love that. Anything else before we move on? All right, well, if you think of more, feel free to keep adding them to the chat. So we're going to talk about a few things today. I'm going to put a link to my handout in the chat. I am going to ask you won't be able to edit in there. So hopefully you just have some paper or pen to jot down some notes in a minute. But here's what I'm going to kind of go over today. So one, what does the literature say specifically about response and feedback? And so for those of you who teach in English or first year comp, this is going to apply to you a lot. If your students don't do a lot of writing, or it's not an intensive writing class, or you're not giving a lot of feedback on writing, I'm not saying none of this will apply, but it might be a little more foreign to you in some ways. But we're going to talk about response literature, feedback literature, what scholarship says, what the experts say we should do, and what is also missing from it. We're going to talk about what my research colleagues and I developed in what we call as question-based pedagogy, and why we developed it and what it looks like, what our research studies, what our results say. And then we're going to talk about how to implement it a little bit in your classes, should you choose. And as well as what we're doing in the connections between culturally responsive pedagogy and linguistic justice. So I'm going to stop sharing for 1 sec. Well, no, actually, I don't have to. So in the handout, I put it in the chat. There's an essay, a student essay on pages 3 and 4. And so we're going to ask that you step into a familiar place. Again, my English people. And I want you, right, the students, this is the first year, it's the first beginning of the semester, it's the first writing assignment. So we've discussed some things, but again, it's first year comp, it's their first assignment. And I asked my students to write a thesis-driven narrative, illustrating, telling me a story, illustrating a belief they hold about humor. And so I just want you, I'm going to give you like 3 minutes. We can be silent, it's okay. And I just want you to give that student response. I put the link to the handout again in the chat in case you came in after. Oh, it's not going. Just respond to it just like you would if it was your student in your class. So I'll give you a couple minutes. Okay, Diana finished reading. Yay. So yeah, so just what feedback would you offer this student to improve the essay? Just again, I know for some of you, if this isn't your discipline, it might be a little foreign to you, but hopefully some of you are English, our first year comp, are have writing intensive classes, so it won't be as foreign. Yeah, Katie.
Thanks. It's so interesting reading this after being into linguistic justice for about a year and a half or so, and sort of what I would have done versus what I might do now. But one thing I wonder about is for something that is such a personal narrative, whether I would have it be thesis driven at all, just because thesis driven says to me, just like point-driven paragraphing does, that the thesis is at the end of the introduction. Each paragraph has a topic sentence that, makes a point that drives the whatever. Whereas here, the thesis is at the end, as would be more typical for exploratory writing or something. So I wonder if I would make sure that for this assignment, they're not writing a thesis-driven narrative at the beginning of the semester at all. They're doing more open-ended, as I said, exploratory writing. And then if I was making an exploratory, I would probably, to help improve it. I mean, it's already really good. I'm trying to find it again to open it again. I guess it downloaded as a Google Doc. But anyway, I'll let someone else speak. Oh, here we go. I got it again. I mean, I guess, the beginning maybe is very simple, the corn dog, the sunny Saturday, how the family was together. It wasn't particularly, it didn't draw me in particularly. So maybe I would think more of the motivator, more about the family relationships, more about the day, something.
Okay, yeah. So maybe some comments on the beginning about details or things she could have added to draw you in a little more as the reader.
Yeah.
Or create more of a context. Love it.
Yeah.
What else? What other comments did you leave or would you leave, anybody? There's no right or wrong answer. No comments at all for her? You'd say nothing to the student? I doubt that. But typically, most of us, when we're leaving feedback for students or response, my assumption would be, we're adding things in the margin or throughout the essay as we're following along. What are the benefits to this type of practice, to this feedback practice, to sort of leaving comments along the way or throughout the essay as we're reading?
Well, I guess the benefit is you're tracking how you're reacting in the moment.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So the students can kind of see where we are at each moment in an essay. Yeah, and Diana said something similar in the chat, right? We can help see the writer, how we're reacting at each part. What other benefits to sort of that traditional feedback, right? Where we're just leaving it wherever we deem necessary.
I think that maybe when students go back to revise, then they have something tangible to kind of see and to work off of and to potentially, work on fixing.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So the students, if they're able to revise or they have the opportunity, they can go back and see again, sort of within the text or in those specific moments where they might want to consider revision. Anything else to the benefits to this type of feedback practice? Okay, what are the drawbacks then to this type of feedback practice?
I'll just say that it can be very impersonal, I think. I have taught composition, but I currently work full-time in the writing center now. And so when I'm giving feedback with a student, I'm typically there with them one-on-one. And so it's a very more conversational, collaborative way to work with students. And so sometimes this asynchronous way of giving feedback can be a little impersonal, I think.
Yeah, 100%. It's impersonal. They're just reading these. Nobody's there, like you said. There's no conversation. There's no back and forth. They're just sort of reading them in a moment in time, probably alone. Yeah, so Diana put in the chat that the feedback from us, from faculty, it's always filtered through our lens as faculty and not through a peer. Other drawbacks to sort of the traditional feedback practice. Yeah, I love that. In the another one in the chat, hard to communicate tone. It's easier, way easier to communicate tone aloud, right, or in video or audio feedback than in written feedback. Any other drawbacks? So yeah, again in the chat, distracted by her verb tense and consistency, and if we said that, maybe that might have demotivated her, or detracted from anything positive we said. Anything else? If you think of one, you can still add it to the chat. But there are various drawbacks and benefits to the traditional model. And we're going to get into a bit more of the drawbacks. So this is our quote unquote literature review. We put a lot in that handout that I provided you, where you can see lots of our favorite excerpts and the works cited page with all sorts of citations. And so just looking at these, I'll give you a minute to skim them. Which phrases, you can just drop the phrase or unmute and say it. Which phrase or sentence or word or part sticks out to you the most as sort of like, yes, like that's what I want, or that's important. Okay, so yeah, the students need to be in control. Absolutely. Other phrases or ideas from here that they don't use it maybe the way we intend. Yeah, I mean, study after study where students feel like their work gets hijacked, or they don't, there's still a quote, you could offer me a lot of money and I couldn't tell you exactly which study it was, but I'll never forget the words where the student was interviewed in it. And they said, well, I know what to do now to get an A, but it's not what I want to do. Like wasn't their goal. Yeah, feedback often valued more by teachers than by students. And a lot of the research, even though we sometimes feel that way, a lot of the research points to the opposite and says that the students do value it, they do want it, but there is a disconnect in our perceptions and the way that we interpret it, the way the students interpret it, and what we're trying to convey. All right. So we decided long time ago, as we met with one of my research colleagues, Dawn Formo. She was holding a workshop at the beginning of the semester, and we were talking about, it was about feedback. And so something, maybe you've experienced it, maybe you haven't, and I feel like even in my discipline, it's not always a guarantee, is a lot of times we don't get training on feedback. Is there anybody in here who just received absolutely zero any kind of training before they began teaching on how to give feedback? Buddy, you can say in the chat, like, I got a little, I got none, I got a lot. But in my experience, it's not zero, okay? Anyone? I don't feel like it's common. All right, I took Katie, I took one class, I don't remember it. I feel like I had one class that it was and I think I only remember it because she's one of my research colleagues now. But it was very little. And it was more so we were going to work in the writing center while we were in grad school. And so it was a lot about writing center help. I don't feel like I still got a lot of help once I became the instructor of record and things like that. And so when we were meeting with Dawn, and she was explaining to us that there are buckets, there are reams of research out there on how to give feedback. So you can go find books, articles, you name it, on how to give feedback as the instructor, as the writing center tutor, as the peer tutor, as the peer in the classroom to the peer. I mean, just so much out there. And she said, but there's, and this was back in 2010 or 11, it has changed. So when I say we've been looking into this for a long time, I mean it. But a little over 10 years ago, we could say very confidently, there was no research, there was nothing published to tell a student writer, to tell a writer how to solicit feedback. Everything was about what the respondent should do, depending upon the hat that they were wearing. The only thing at that time when Dawn was working on some publications that she could find was one sentence in a chapter of a textbook that said, the direction to you, student writer, is get feedback. And that was it. So myself, Cindy, and Shannon, our other research colleagues, and I went up to her after and said, well, what do we do about that? Right? How is it still everyone telling writers what to do, but there's nothing helping writers think about what they want to do and how they should get feedback? So we completely redesigned our classes about 10 years ago. We revised our syllabus, and we have our syllabus excerpts in the handout to make clear that this feedback was not going to be provided in a very traditional format in our class. And that students were going to have to engage in the process. They were going to include 3 questions anytime they would submit an essay to us, and a lot of times with their peers when we were peer editing, they would include 3 questions that they would like us to answer about their essay. And that's all we answer. We don't say anything else. They dictate, they control, they lead the feedback. They are not very effective in the beginning, typically. That, it's a mixed bag, but generally speaking, they struggle with developing questions, the questions that they find effective personally, the ones that they want to ask in the beginning. So question asking is infused into everything we do in class. We're asking questions about what we're reading. We're asking questions of each other. We're playing games where we're asking questions about things. They're practicing asking questions about their essays, you name it. And then they're always reflecting. They're always thinking about the questions they asked, the feedback they received via their questions, the feedback they're providing their peers. And then revision. We're always revising their questions. And if they're still working on that essay, they're revising that essay at all. And then really what we said, well, the only way we're going to know if we're actually helping them develop the skill set to solicit feedback is if they don't ask us questions, we're not going to give them substantive feedback. And this is usually where we don't give them anything on paper in writing. And this is usually where people, if we're in person, the whispers, the pearl clutching a little bit, like, well, what? You just don't tell them anything. Well, we're in class with them all the time. We're still teaching. We're still learning. They can come to office hours and ask us whatever they want. They can come to class early. They can stay after class. So it's not like we don't ever talk to them ever outside of those 3 questions. But when we are grading, when we are reading their essays, we limit ourselves to their 3 questions. And it's not easy. So we decided we had to figure out if there was a way to see if what we were doing was working for students. Was it helping them with anything? Were we hurting them? What's happening? And so we developed this final question log. And this really is the meat of our first research project. And it's also in the handout as well that I provided. And across 4 institutions, Cal State San Marcos, Maricosta College, Mount San Jacinto College, and Palomar College, we collected over 1,300 final reflections. We did our qualitative grounded theory. We did a thematic analysis and look for, themes that we could generate for what students were telling us. What are they learning from this, and what can we learn from them? And after we analyzed those logs across those semesters, except for spring 2020, for obvious reasons, it was just, a mess moving between face-to-face and online. So we knew those would not be solid samples. This is what we generated. So we had 3 themes that we generated in the data. The first one was that question asking evolves, and we'll show you students' own words illustrating all of these themes. Writerly agency, no, students do not use the words writerly agency, but a lot of them talked about, we saw it across 94 of our student participants. Their confidence was growing. They felt like they knew what to do, that felt more in control. They had ideas when they went back into their writing. And this awareness of transferability, and it is our smallest theme, at least in our first iteration of our study, but it was still big to us, because if almost 40% are still seeing this question asking, these writing skills, it's things that they can take with them to other assignments, to other courses, then we were happy. So now, as we're starting to go through our data, new data, conduct thematic analysis all over again, we're starting to see different themes emerge as we start to make our classrooms more anti-racist, more culturally responsive. 91% value constructive feedback. They want it. They want to get better. 20% have this regret and or fear of not engaging. So there are some that are realizing that, oh, I didn't ask questions enough, or I wish I had asked more, or they kind of fear that it's a little scary to them to ask their instructor questions. And that, I thought of that when, I forget who it was on the student panel, when he was saying, I think it was Oswaldo, the tutor, he's like, they don't want to go back and ask them, telling, go ask your instructor this. And he's like, they don't want to. And that 37% are valuing community in the way that they're asking questions of each other, the way that it's bringing them together when we peer edit, and things like that. So for writerly agency, so one student, these are all aliases, one student says, understanding my own writing in a way that I could view it from another person's perspective and reviewing it as an unbiased third party is difficult. But once I understood how to ask questions from that perspective and the valuable feedback that I could gain from it, it made it rewarding to work on and improve. So again, he's showing that he's thinking about somebody else's perspective, that audience awareness, and how he's going to make changes. Frankie's quote is one that we just absolutely love, because she said asking questions has made her reread her essay over and over. And this is something we see our students say, well, I thought about my questions and I realized I could kind of answer them. So I read my essay again, thinking about what else could I ask about. And that right there for us is a win, that they're not just writing an initial draft, printing it out, or uploading it and calling it a day, that it's requiring them or asking of them without us telling them to go back into their text. That they value constructive feedback. George says, I'm afraid of people critiquing my essay because I don't want to know if I did bad. I only want to know if I did good, but I just got to take the criticism and improve. And we see this. I had a student one semester, very shy, very quiet. I don't know if she spoke in class, more than a handful of times. And every time she turned in her essay with questions, every question was set to only elicit praise from me, to only elicit positive feedback from me. That's what she wanted. She wanted to focus in on what she was doing well. What did I think she should continue to do? Things like that. So for them, it allows them to really customize it to what they want as the writer, as the student, as the person. Yeah, Diana put in the chat, they absolutely can be hard on themselves. I mean, they really are often their own worst critic, where we're telling them, again, I feel like the student was saying that in the panel, like, no, you can do it. No, it's not bad, right? That's sometimes that's the hardest part of our job. Valuing community. So Lisa said we started a group chat and we kept communication open the entire time. We've all been understanding the struggles we're going through right now. And because of that, we have been more open to putting in extra time so that we all succeed. We feel invested in everyone's success. That right there is huge to us. We know I'm going to get more into culturally responsive and culturally relevant pedagogy in a little bit, that it needs a community, that it's not optional to be a culturally responsive class. So again, constructive feedback, community, and this, my colleagues and I are all white women. There's things that we're just never going to understand about our students from that personal perspective. We can try, we listen, we ask questions. But Jonique said it was very helpful receiving feedback from students who've gone through somewhat of the same racial experiences as myself. I can't give that to my students depending upon what their lived experience is. And so again, putting them together, letting them ask questions of each other, as well as us as instructors, opens up way more perspective. The peers can offer them things that I can't. So again, that community building at play as well. So what I want you to do is look back at that student's essay. These were the 3 questions that she included when she turned it into me. So I'm going to give you 3-ish minutes. And I just want you to answer her questions. So you can just jot down notes somewhere, think about it in your head. But I want to give you 3 minutes to think about what she asked when she submitted it. All right. So what other kinds of details should I add to make my story sound more interesting? How do I work on my run-on? And how does my conclusion sound? So what are some of the comments you made in response to these 3 questions? You can put it in the chat. No, it's not going back. There we go. What are some of the comments you made? So Diana put in the chat, if the thesis is that humor brings people closer, it allows us to connect with others. And I love that you quoted, right, the students' words. You might want to add more about family feeling disconnected before the Siegel incident. So, okay, love it. So here's a detail that you might want to add. Yeah, Katie said that she really doesn't have a run-on. Maybe she has one, but it's not really a big problem. I do know this student, while she was in my first year comp, she did, this was a while ago, so it was like right on the AB 705 change for those of you at a California community college. She did take a not transferable, lower level one. So I always wonder, was that something she really worked on in that class? But yeah, it's not really an issue for her. Anything for question 3 about her conclusion? No, it's not. I didn't give you loads of time, but if you have something about either one, you can just keep adding them to the chat. Okay, so a little cliche at the end. It was all worth it. Okay. What's different about the feedback this round? Anything different, or what is different about what you told the student when you were answering these questions versus just the sort of open-ended, whatever you wanted to say?
Well, it's interesting to see what the student writer is concerned about. And it reminds me that what I was thinking, say, about the verb tense or whatever, wasn't something they were concerned about, at least not at that point. And it was pretty minor also, because generally the verb tense was consistent and sophisticated. I was interested to see that she had a question about detail And like the other person responded, I thought more detail in the intro would be helpful. So that was kind of nice to see that there was some
overlap.
Do you find that it varies, like that students are often asking questions that you completely didn't anticipate, or that there's kind of a mix?
It's definitely a mixed bag. We put some sample questions in the packet as well, but I'll get things sometimes that have nothing to do with their essay. And I don't, it might be about the topic itself and they just want to talk to me about it. So those are definitely less common, but we get lots. Yeah. So, but I love what you said, Katie, that it's something that you originally wanted to say wasn't what she asked about. So yeah, a lot of times my inclination, what I want to tell them is not what they ask me about. And sometimes it does overlap. Anything else different this round when you were just trying to answer her questions? What about, I think we started to kind of answer these next two questions a little bit, and so we can mix it up, but what are some drawbacks or benefits to this type of feedback? What do you see as a drawback or benefit when we're answering the three questions that students have included versus that traditional way we tend to offer feedback?
Well, like I said, you might want to give some feedback that they're not asking for, and particularly if that's related to a course outcome or something, I guess you would want to make sure that that's addressed at some point.
And we don't if they don't ask about it or they don't talk to us. There's nothing. So it does happen sometimes that they may not earn a very good grade for whatever reason. But our answers to the questions don't really explain why. They're usually in our office, or staying after class. So we definitely don't ignore them. But if that's why that question asking evolved. They start to really think about what they want to ask and why. But yeah, we might not get to highlight something. Anna, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that I think, yeah, that potentially students might not know what questions to ask. And so, maybe potentially they're missing out on something. But I assume that maybe in the classroom you're talking about like what makes a good question or.
Oh, we talk about questions so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, like just this last week, I had them all decide on three questions. I said, okay, pretend you're sitting one-on-one with me today. What would you want to ask me about your draft you have? Then they got into groups, and then each group put some questions on the board, and then they decided as a class which questions they wanted for peer editing that day. But we revised them before, like, well, I go, would you know how to answer that for your peer? No, I'm not sure. And so we do lots of question work. But yeah, they do struggle. And we build question banks. So we tell them that's the only good plagiarism in class. Steal your peers' questions, adapt them, adopt them. Yeah, Diana put in the chat, sometimes their questions reflect their anxiety or negative that they've received in the past, 100%, where they are worried about things that I'm like, what? I've literally said not to be worried. Like, for example, grammar or punctuation, that is not anything that I ever stress in my class, ever. In fact, I tell them I don't care most of the time unless I genuinely don't know what's happening in your paper, which is so unbelievably rare. And sometimes they still ask about it. And so, yeah, Diana, I always wonder like how much of that is just past writing class trauma that they've just been, told over and over again they can't use commas or whatever it may be. What about the benefits to restricting our feedback to their three questions?
I think that it gives students a lot more agency. I think that so much when it comes to writing, a lot of like the fear and the anxiety that a lot of students face is that I don't know, I'm not the authority here. And so it sounds like what you're doing is you're giving that agency back to students and saying, yes, you do know, you do have some authority here. It is your voice. And so I imagine that it's empowering for students.
Yeah, 100%. I don't want to dictate what they should think about or find important when they go back to work on their essay again, right? Like I want them to have really truly have control over that. What about as benefits to this as the instructor? Usually we get some folks realize it was a little easier for us in some ways. I know what we usually hear a lot is most of us, if not all of us, if you're in this discipline, we don't want to overwhelm students with comments. We know that students can absolutely, it's too much. And so then we have to do the mental work of deciding, well, what do we tell them? Like, I can't tell them everything. That's nobody can, that's not good. That's not good practice in general. But it takes that away. I don't have to sit there and go, okay, I don't want to write something on every single paragraph. What am I going to tell them? They take that work away. And then I love that, Diana. You don't feel like you're typing into a void. I don't. I feel like I'm talking to my students. So even though I know Anna mentioned earlier, like, wow, when it's that asynchronous, you're not in person, it feels like this very flat, it's not dialogue, it's not conversation. And in a lot of ways, I feel like it mitigates that and definitely not a void. They asked me this, here's what I want to, here are my answers. I love that. And then typically, this wasn't anything that we sought out to solve or see, but it's faster. And I know that's something that we struggle with. If you have a 4 or 5 classes, it's so time consuming. And so it takes away some of that mental work that does take up time, as well as some of that, I don't even know where to stop, how much do I tell them? Oh, I love that, Anna. Yeah, you felt like you were having a conversation when you were answering her questions. It also is just one more way I get to know my students. I get to know their word choices for particular things. And they start to learn mine. Because sometimes when I'm answering a question, I'll say, okay, use this word. To me, this means this, and that's how I'm answering it. So they start, right? We really get to know each other. It also starts to help them think about word choice and other things. So, all right. So then as we did this, I can put, I'll put a link in the chat to our first article. If you want to read it, zero pressure, but if you can see way more details of how we did all this. But then as we were working our way into our next article, we were like, okay, we're doing so much equity and linguistic justice and culturally responsive and culturally relevant teaching work. We started to see these overlaps between the disciplines, between the scholarship that we weren't seeing either at all in some ways, or seeing very little the overlap between the disciplines. So, for example, these were 4 categories we saw in both disciplines. These ideas of partnership, this idea of community, this idea of motivation, and student agency. So if we were seeing this in feedback and response literature, and we were seeing this in linguistic justice, culturally responsive literature as well. So as an example, and we just, no particular order. So with our feedback scholars, Nash and Winstone say that feedback should be a shared responsibility. It's not all on them. It's not all on you. Community, Krista Ratcliffe in her rhetorical listening says, we need to actually listen to our students and not listen to them as academics, where usually our gut reaction is to listen to respond. And that's not what we should be doing. Nancy Summers, if you've done any feedback research whatsoever, I'm sure you've read her, it was saying back in the 80s that feedback should move students to revise, that whatever we're saying to them should give them some motivation, some sort of direction. It's not just us saying, this is vague, this is awkward, I don't understand, things like that. And then Treglia in her article says that students do want feedback, but they want their autonomy intact. They want suggestions, not commands. So then, as we kept doing research, we see the overlap with everyone else. So Gloria Ladson-Billings, right, the seminal work on culturally responsive teaching says that culturally responsive pedagogy, those classrooms are committed to the collective empowerment. So again, that community, it's shared. This is a group effort. This is not on a person. Joe Feldman, if you've read Grading for Equity, he talks about building a community of feedback. So again, we're listening to each other. Motivation, Hammond, if you've read Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, it provides actionable feedback, right? That again, it's something they could do. It's not those vague, esoteric, you know, I don't understand this. And I'm like, okay, but I understood it as the writer. So I don't know what to do with that. And then Inouye, right, Sal, if you've read, I'm sure you've read some of his stuff on contract grading and in equity in writing classrooms, that deep attending, that building patience and listening to students, particularly students who don't sound like us. So when I think of Krista Ratcliffe in the response and the feedback literature saying, we need to listen and not listen just to respond. And then we have a Sal Inouye over here saying, yeah, and we need to listen really well, especially when they don't sound like us, and how much, you know, we're not necessarily trained. We get in there, we're the quote unquote expert, but we're not, we don't know everything. And so listening to our students as much as we can. And so for us, it's now we're working towards explaining how this is, or that it is not the only, but a culturally relevant feedback practice. That question-based pedagogy allows us to do in our classrooms, allows space for our students to do. The overlap with what scholars say effective feedback, effective response does, that overlaps with what culturally responsive and culturally relevant teaching practices do, that we can see where they all have some overlap now. And so then when we put all of our students' reflections in, these were the most common words that came out of them, right? They're asking community, partnership, collective, confidence, motivation, all of these things that they're gaining by bringing them into this process, both in peer-to-peer and peer with instructor. It also works really well online, especially in asynchronous classes where I don't feel like I get to know my students nearly as well as I get to know my face-to-face students, because they have to ask me questions. And there's just a weird thing about the 18 to 20-year-olds right now. I don't know if you experience it. They don't like to email. They don't like to ask questions. They literally won't know what to do. And they will just kind of sit and languish and just like hope it works out. But this gets them used to asking me questions. We've had multiple students say, if it wasn't for this, I would have never asked you a question. And so building those bridges and showing them that we care about them, we'll answer their questions, they can keep asking us. So we can chat and talk. I can go into some activities we do in our courses. It's totally up to you. We have about 15 or so minutes, give or take, maybe 10. So you tell me, activities, chat, thoughts, questions. I'm down for whatever we want to do. Yeah, the asynchronous classes, it's hard. Yeah, go for it, Katie.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned Asao Inouye's work, because I've been really working with his labor-based grading to work on their intrinsic motivation. And I'm realizing, it's been hard to change my feedback process as I learn. And so this is, it's still not as much students having the locus of control, although it's changing, but this putting it really in their power with asking the questions, I think would be a great shift for me and for them.
And it doesn't have to be. I know sometimes when we do these presentations that folks are like, ooh, like this is heavy. You don't have to jump all in. So sometimes what my colleagues will do is say, okay, the next essay, I'm going to have them include one question or two questions. And I'm still going to give them feedback the way I do, but I'm also going to answer their questions. And then they kind of slowly, and then say, okay, on the essay after that, I'll have them include questions, and I'm just going to only say one thing on each page. So like they're kind of weaning themselves as the instructor and bridging that gap with students. But it really just is that practice. The students really want, yeah, they really want to practice. So like, so for example, this is all in the handout, our syllabus revisions, our logs, my thesis workshop that I revised, an online paragraph workshop. We also have a chart in there where we talk about the online version of what we would be doing face-to-face, so you can adapt it, question banking. So again, we changed so much of our syllabi to make clear. Oh, thanks, Diana. Thanks for coming and chatting. That this is going to be a different class, that they are involved in this class, that their voice matters, they have agency, I care what they think, what they say, and they are going to be a participant in this process. Peer review. We talk about peer review a lot. And I know that peer review doesn't always work in some classes. We don't really have time to go into this slide too much, but so much out there. And a lot of colleagues will talk to you, will say peer review falls flat for various reasons. And we don't experience that with the questions. And so these were just some quotes we were looking at a few weeks ago. Like, so many people are saying we've just told so many of the writers. I mean, Peter Elbow literally said to be quiet and listen. And we have Felisa Rose Chavez now, thankfully, saying like, no, you need to talk. It should be the writer leading the discussion. And it should be in service of the author's agenda and not this passive receiving of feedback, that they are in control. So it is starting to shift now, at least, but. And then, so like a thesis workshop, these are some of my students walking around the room. Before question-based pedagogy, they would, they're putting up thesis statements, arguments about different movies we were watching. This was a while back. And so they would walk around and they would leave comments, here's what we think as a group about this thesis. But now I restrict them to questions at some point. What do you want to ask them if that is their argument? And so they have to come up with questions they're asking. And then as they move around the room, it gets harder to think of new questions. They struck like, the last three groups asked everything we wanted to ask. And so then they really have to sit and kind of think with it. And I walk around and help facilitate. But again, I didn't overhaul my class. I just said, okay, well, instead of statements, we're going to ask our peers some things, or maybe do both. Online paragraph workshop. So sometimes we have students put a paragraph, a piece of their writing up. And so one student put her paragraph up in class, and Edith's question for her paragraph was, is my explanation sufficient, or should I elaborate more on the illustration provided? And the class looked at her and said, you should elaborate more. And we said, was that helpful? And she said, no. So let's change your question then, right? Mariah, do I need to further explain my viewpoint? The student went, yes. Mariah's like, that's not what I wanted, right? So again, we're always practicing. We're always building that community. They're always reading each other's work. They're always offering feedback. Questions about the text. We talk about this more on page 16. They'll read something for homework, and then they, as a group, will develop questions, higher order questions, and that's what leads our discussion for class. Again, putting more control into them, showing them that they have ideas, they can think of questions, they can ask all sorts of things, and letting that sort of guide some of our discussions in class. And then we have student-led question banking. You can do it in various ways. For my online classes, I just have a discussion board with 0 points, not graded, that they all can put questions on at any point that they've been using. They can elaborate if they want and say, oh, you should ask this. This was really helpful, or this was terrible. It didn't, here's why, or here's how I'm going to change it. But then that way, if a student's stuck, I also don't want somebody to not ask questions because they don't know what to ask. So they can always go into this and look through questions that students have been using. All right, I'm going to stop just talking for a minute there, but anything else anyone wants to say? Final words, thoughts, comments about feedback?
Does your handout have advice on what you have them read as they're trying to learn how to ask questions, or?
No, because only because the three of us, Dawn is she's the dean of undergraduate right now, so she's not in the classroom, but the three of us who teach, we teach we have different styles, we teach different content, we teach different levels, we teach just different courses, period. So it varies so much. So in my first year comp, it might be an article on moral panic or an AI. And I might be asking them to develop questions where Cindy might be teaching her upper division course on, it might be one that for folks going into the credential who want to teach K through 12. So we just teach such different things. But I would say if it's anything that you would have them read, they can develop questions about it, in my opinion. Maybe you practice one in class before they do it for homework if you think it might be a little dense. Plus, then they get used to questions. When you read and you don't annotate, it's like you never read it, right? And research says highlighting and highlighting alone is basically like a hair above doing nothing, like you didn't read it. And so I'm always trying to get them, we create all this annotation stuff, and I'm always trying to get them to engage with the text as they're like, make your side of that conversation known. And so having them think of questions usually helps them begin annotating pretty regularly as well. Anything else? Final thoughts, questions, comments? Well, thank you so much. I won't hold you here anymore. We can go back to the main room, but thanks so much for hanging out with me. And you have all our email addresses if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thanks.